Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of our Pep Chats, our live stream conversations where we introduce really cool guests who kind of help us explore the challenges in the future world of work and the differences, I suppose, in making good teams great. My name is Niall. For any of you who tune into PepTalk events regularly, you'll know who I am, but for those of you who don't, my background is in sports psychology. I've worked as a mental skills coach with a number of high-performing teams and athletes all over the world. And a couple of years ago, I came home to Ireland and started working with my co-host today, James Brogan. Hiya, James. How you doing?
Hi, Niall. Great to be back again. How are you? I'm
good, man. Yeah, and just explaining my background, but really the reason that I got involved with PepTalk was the vision that you guys had around, creating a different environment in the world of work and recognizing the human at the center of the organization. And that's something that I know is at the core of what drives you to make PepTalk successful.
Yeah, no, it's just a very, listen, as we talked about, Niall, and we talk about weekly here, it's just such a challenging time. Apologies, there might be a little bit of background noise there, but yeah, listen, the environment that we're trying to create in organizations is ultimately to support retention, engagement, attraction, and it's a very challenging time. So I'm really looking forward to our guest today and kind of, again, having a good debate about how we support organizations and, as you say, be that difference between good and great teams.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that's a nice segue into introducing our guest today. Today, we're joined by Luke Lavery. Luke is CEO of a company called PostPro UK. And at the heart of what they do is they help professional athletes find, I suppose, a new role post-transition into the world of work and into the corporate world. Luke, you're very welcome. Nice to have you on board.
Hi, guys. How you doing?
All good. All good. I'm really looking forward to the chat today. It's an interesting topic, and particularly interesting for me as my kind of background. A lot of the work I did and a lot of research I did before I came back home to Ireland was in the whole area of athlete transition. So tying the conversation of athlete transition with the issues facing the corporate world, I think, is really interesting. And that's an area that you're kind of uniquely placed to talk about, because you're maybe that's a good place to start. If you give us a little bit of insight into where the idea for PostPro came from and how you guys have developed it into an organization having a serious impact on people's lives.
Yeah, cool. Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me on. It's good to meet you both. For me, the journey for PostPro started in another business that I owned that basically designed, built and managed graduate and apprenticeship programs in the UK. And a lot of that was working with big companies, but simultaneously trying to bring to life those industries to young people at an age early enough where actually they could start to envisage themselves doing it, but figure out the right pathway to get there. And for me, what I was really passionate about was, how do you level the playing field? How do you remove nepotism that, for all best intentions of big companies, still exists a lot of the times? And how do you give somebody who hasn't gone to university or who is the first in their family to go to university the same opportunities and the same understanding of what the expectations are of employers? And then through personal circumstance for myself, knew the tie-ins of that to professional sport, and a very similar kind of ethos and thought process. But as I'm sure you're well aware yourself, Niall, if you meet a former footballer or a rugby player, it doesn't matter. I'm 35, so 17 years away from where that would have happened to me. But within 2 minutes, most people would have told you that they played professional football at some point. And it's that definition of their lives. And can you come to terms with the new you? And my passion and my belief is centered around, if you can reach the top 0.1% of a population in one thing, you have the skills to go do that in anything else. And for us, really, it's just about connecting those dots and showcasing what's possible.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because, you know, for all of us, whether you're a professional athlete or working in the corporate world or an artist or whatever, our identity gets tied up in what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And you're absolutely right. Like I interviewed probably 70 to 100 athletes for a book that I've been writing for a long time, and finally it's finished and it's getting published, thank God. But I interviewed a ton of athletes on trying to understand, you know, who they were as people as opposed to who they were as performers. And what was really interesting was when I asked them the simple question from a psychological point of view, who are you? The response was always, I used to be a footballer, I used to be a rugby player, I used to be. And if you think about in the normal course of events, when we retire, if our identity is tied up into what we do for a living our whole lives, when we retire, we're completely lost because we cease to be that. You know, it's
for sure. And for me, like, one thing that I'm really concerned with is that, and where we try, I suppose, action our efforts, is that all too often people will come away from something and you have a very narrow tunnel of vision because you have certain people around you that you can reach out to for support, but by definition they're going to steer you down a path that they know as well. And so actually, how do you, if you might be the best software developer in the world but you've got no way of knowing that, how do you create that bridge? And a lot of the time the result is that people have that necessity to go and earn money, and so they fall into a career, any career. That could be in young footballers, we see it a lot, where they go into labouring or construction or part-time shift work or coaching, and it's a really difficult cycle to break, because where do you find the time to actually invest in yourself and what you could be doing, what you'd be great at, where your strengths are, where your passions are? And it's a real conundrum, I think, for a lot of people, and generally in business as well, in terms of how many people would love to change career if they could. They just don't know where to start and how to go about doing so.
Yeah, and it actually ties in lovely with the whole conversation kind of around attrition and the Great Resignation. That disconnection is a massive issue now, and you know, a lot of people are changing jobs, and it's more down to the lack of relationships they have in the workplace rather than any great ambition for money or any great ambition for you know, a higher rank or whatever the case may be. And when you see some of the stats, and I always find it really interesting when you look at stats and they bring them into monetary terms. And HBR did an interesting piece of research recently where they were talking about 65% of workers feeling less connected to their colleagues, and employee disconnection is one of the main drivers of voluntary turnover. And what's a really interesting line from the research I thought was that lonely employees cost US companies up to $460 billion a year, which is incredible. But you're thinking about lonely, and you're thinking about identity, and you're thinking about how you connect to workers. And James, I'll bring you in there. That whole connection piece is one of the fundamental challenges for organizations and for leaders in organizations, right?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, it's, you know, organizations are still in the early stages of trying to figure this out, Niall, and I think the big thing that we hear a lot is belonging. You know, how do I build belonging and identity, in particular if you're in a hybrid environment? And the interesting thing, I think, for people who've played sport, they understand the importance of the team and they understand the importance of your colleagues, getting to know your colleagues. And I think that's been a real challenge right now for organizations, how we build that sense of connection and belonging. And ultimately, that's what we do in PepTalk. It's about creating that environment. It's about having conversations, about being intentional about things. And I think that's something that, for people who have been part of teams, whether, as you say, it's in sport, business, or even, you know, family, connection is definitely under threat at the moment. And you know, productivity tools and Zoom and these technologies are great for, in some way, keeping us connected, but really what's the deeper, more meaningful piece that people want to feel part of something. And I think that ultimately is really at the heart of a lot of the challenges that organizations are faced with now when it comes to retention. yeah, at PepTalk, we ultimately believe by creating the environment, we're going to kind of keep people and make them engaged. So it's a really interesting topic, Niall.
Yeah, I think so. And I think when you bring kind of the figures into it, it kind of puts a different perspective on it. And there's Haley and our marketing team's done some phenomenal work in pulling together some, and I should mention this each week, that the slides and all the lovely PepTalk branding and that is down to the wonderful work being done by our marketing team and by Haley in particular. But one thing she found recently was, when we look at the flip side of that the employees who experience high levels of belonging, there's a decrease in turnover risk and an increase in job performance. And what's really interesting from a Better Up study was they also talked about a reduction in sick days, an increase in employer promoter score, which results in annual savings of $52 million for a 10,000 person company. Now, it's not always easy to follow the numbers in that regard, but it is fascinating that when you look at those two pieces of research from two different organizations, there's a huge cost to the company in being disconnected and a huge benefit to the company in being connected. And I guess the question, and I suppose, James, I'll go to you first and then I'll go to Luke, but the question I suppose I have is, when organization, like a lot of organizations don't fully understand what a great culture is. So there's all this kind of mythical stuff around culture, and they often struggle to understand, well, how do our middle management bring that connection into teams? What's your thoughts on that, about that kind of that path from the disconnected to the reconnected, I suppose?
Yeah, and I think probably it links back to the previous piece, Niall, in terms of that intentionality. I think our managers in particular have a huge responsibility right now to be much more intentional with connection and think about it and look at their behaviors and their skill sets, and ultimately that's part of the transformation that organizations are now going through, thinking about the skill sets and the competencies their managers are going to in particular need to bring connection to life. For example, as you're aware, Niall, in PepTalk, the team talk, which is obviously this lovely commitment from organizations facilitated by ourselves to just talk about a non-work related topic every month. It's simple, it's effective, and it's powerful because it allows people to feel part of something and ultimately understand and learn something about their colleagues. And I think that's the pathway towards connection. It's about intentionality, and it's about doing things then together collectively as a team that aren't all about work. And I think that's what can help ultimately on that journey towards creating some of the improvements that ultimately you will see as the stats suggest. But it is a journey, and you need to kind of continue to foster and build it. And I think that's what it can happen. And I think there's just a need right now for organizations and managers in particular to lean into this area and look at their week and their month and think about what they're going to do to engage their teams in a different way. Because if they're just continuously focusing on what we did previously or jumping into lots of Zoom calls and it's all very work centric, people will get disengaged and feel disconnected from themselves and their team. So that would be my initial piece. It's about intentionality and building small little habits within your team.
Yeah, and it makes a ton of sense. And Luke, from your perspective, with the work you're doing, do you see, like, what would you see are the ingredients in the companies who successfully embed your clients, your ex-athletes into their organizations? Is there that team cohesion piece that makes it easier for an athlete to engage with them?
I'd use similar language, to be fair. I think for us, the other side of what we do is deliver leadership programs which center around emotional intelligence, self-awareness, developing relationships, effective communication, which is everything James is kind of alluding to in the roles of managers, really. And for me, like as a business owner myself, that's probably been the biggest wake-up call over the last 12 months. I've made some major, with all due respect to them, hiring errors because I've gone off the previous way that I would normally do things. Naturally, as a person, I'm kind of ever an optimist. I always think, I really like that person, I want to work with them. I'll ignore the value potential for a minute in the sense of I'll be able to create that with them because we like each other. And actually, what I've had to become a lot more mindful of, mainly because it's not worked for the other people and they've said, look, this isn't the right role for me, to be upfront with you, is what other people need. Quite selfishly, I've built my business the way I've built it because for years I traveled back and forth to London, and then I looked and evaluated the impact that has on me, my wife, my kids, my behaviors, and think that's not right for me anymore. I'm going to have this digital business for all intensive purposes. But I then have somebody who works for me who lives alone, and they're in a small company and they're relying on me and my company for interaction. And I didn't probably catch on to their circumstances quick enough as to what do they need from me in their working day. And similarly, somebody who'd come from a background in the police and professional sport who came to work for us and needed that rigidity of timetables and doing things at this time. And actually, that's been a massive wake-up call for me, just in the general sense of circadian rhythms. Like, if you've got a digital business, you've got to be really mindful of when do people do their best work. And I found it quite difficult. I'm a morning person, so I'll like get up before my kids do and work 4:30, 5 till like 7. But if somebody's a night person and working 8 till 11, that's really hard to have a semblance of productivity. And similarly, I think that's the benefit of a workplace. You're in a place for a period of time, so you can talk, you can bounce, and it masks some of the relationships that you have. I'd say now, personally, I feel like I'm in a team now where I've got probably the strongest relationships from a work perspective that I've ever had. But it's down to common purpose and passion and a shared vision, as opposed to knowing the people well, liking the people at this moment in time. I feel we're connected in terms of what we're trying to achieve, what our backstories are, and that's been deliberate from me. I'd say, rather than a disconnect, I've learned from the disconnect, and I'd probably, in my own sense, call it a realignment, in the sense of I've learned from what is happening and tried to do things a little bit differently.
That's really interesting, actually, and it's something that I spoke to somebody the other day who works with one of the big tech companies over here, and they've been working remotely, like pretty much everyone, for the last 2 years, but are continuing to work remotely, but felt a pressure on them, particularly in the last couple of weeks, to go back to the office. Not a pressure from the company for them to be back in the office, but a pressure themselves from the relationship point of view of feeling the fear of proximity bias and the fact that the people who are in the office with the manager are going to get more opportunities to be promoted, to grow, to get the better projects, whatever the case may be. And I thought it was a really fascinating piece. And it's something that we think a lot about, is that kind of the difference, and what is it that makes a difference. And when we talk about doing things differently, I think both of you have already kind of touched on the importance of, like, I've always struggled with the term soft skills, because there's nothing soft or easy about emotional intelligence and good communication and all these kind of things that you know, they're actually the last things we think about as human beings when we're under pressure and needing to deliver something, and we don't appreciate the value in values, if you know what I mean. But there's one box on the slide here that says forget B2B and B2C and focus on H2H. And James, that's kind of pretty much what you're talking about, isn't it? It's that acknowledging the whole person, and it's something that PepTalk I've introduced in relation to kind of a new way of working, where we're trying to deliver opportunities for people to work at their optimum level by giving them the structures they need. Is that fair to say?
Totally, and that's then, yeah. Listen, as I touched on, that's creating that environment, Niall. You know, I think in our industry, you know, the problem sometimes is that we send people on courses or give them programs because we believe, you know, for example, burnout. You know, if a particular person who's burnt out, send them on a course to help them with their burnout, but then they come back into that same environment on a Monday morning and they begin to feel, you know, as they did last week. And I think that's where it's about acknowledging the human, having the conversation, but then looking at the environment. And I think without looking at the environment, we just need to be careful about, you know, knee-jerk responses. And I think during COVID, there's been a lot of that. There's been a lot of things thrown at employees to help them. But now it's about kind of, you know, as we begin to, you know, look towards the future and have a better, more clarity as to, you know, what the world of work is going to be. I think we need to really focus on that environment that the employee and in particular, obviously, the human. What does that environment feel like for a human being? And as Luke touched on, how do we enable people who maybe want to have their work environment is more centric towards the morning, and what does that mean for others? And the only way you can unpick that is by human conversations and understanding each other better. And that needs to start. And we obviously, Niall, as you know, trying to underpin a lot of this with trust, you know, and how do you build trust and how do you create that environment where people can have a conversation, that are not afraid to talk about how they prefer to work. They prefer to work in the morning or whatever. So I think the human to human piece, it stands out to me on this slide as being key. And I think that's not easy, as you say. That's not easy for some organizations. It's not easy for managers. But I think unless they acknowledge and try and, you know, look to improve, then, you know, ultimately employees will vote with their feet and go to a place where they are seen as more of a human being, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. Luke, one of the things there, it's something that I've always been a fan of, and it was on one of the slides there about reaching teams where they are. And I've always been a kind of like, if you're working with a team who want to be world champions, but they've had a losing season last season, you know, you got to start where you're at. It's great to have that ambition, but you have to start where you're at. And when you're meeting people where they're at, if you guys have a set of values in your organization of how you work, and that brings your team together, and by inference to what you were saying earlier, I'm assuming that you feel productivity is enhanced by the relationships you guys have and the way you work together. How do you marry that to organizations where, you know, inherently the values aren't quite where you guys are at? And is there a conflict, or is it more we've got to kind of adapt and kind of assist them on the road to understanding the
yeah.
kind of...
I mean, I think we see our role in that as we're not there to connect the dots for them. We're there to showcase and challenge and prompt and provocate, and give examples of related industries, different industries, challenge them to think. A great one for us is, people will see us as a sports organization, but we do a lot in the corporate world. And you take the example of as simple as Gareth Southgate going to watch Eddie Jones and looking at the difference between football training and rugby training. And then you put that question to a CEO and go, well, how much do you go watch what other business leaders and other organizations are doing? How much do you interact with your clients to go spend the day with them, see how they do it, bring that back and challenge yourselves to look at what you're doing? So that's how we try go about it, and let them come to find their own answers in their own context, but by giving them prompts, giving them challenges, questioning some of the things that they're doing, and looking at it. You know, I think to give a quick sporting analogy, one of the things that we did a podcast on this week, it's all around the identity of young players and academy players, and should we be labeling people the next Raheem Sterling, for instance? And what kind of impression does that stimulate at 9 or 10 for the parents and the player themselves? You're setting yourself up when you've only got a 1% chance of making it. And similarly, in the workplace, are we doing the same thing? Are we talking about promotions? Are we talking about career progression in the right context? Are we making it realistic? Are we making it something that's achievable and relevant to what they're doing?
Absolutely, yeah, and it actually comes into a really interesting conversation there when you talk about enabling managers to manage. The identification of the talents required to be a great manager, I passionately believe, are changing as we go through, you know, the last couple of years in the future. The idea of being, you know, eyes on everyone, sitting on the one floor with all their little cubbies, and you're watching everyone, and there's kind of almost a performing to make sure that people look busy, to now half your staff, 3/4 of your staff, whatever it is, you may never see them. You know, we had a company offsite day recently where we were trying to kind of establish what way we wanted to work as a company going forward. And there was at least 5 people in that room that I'd never met before, you know, because companies are hiring all the time through the pandemic, but we're all isolated and remote. So what is it that a manager needs to lead a team now compared to what a manager needed to lead the team 2 years ago? And there's that kind of, I think it's created a really interesting conversation around identification of leadership skills. And this is where I think with the work you guys do, this idea, like there was that kind of traditional thing that the best performer on your team automatically becomes the leader of the team. So if you think about that in a sales perspective, and I talk about this all the time, but it's like, if you're the number one salesman, you're generally driven by the bottom line. You're driven by, getting sales over the line and the commission check. But if you're going to be a great sales leader, you have to be driven by what's right for all of your team, not for you. And it becomes it's a very different skill set. So it's kind of, from your perspective, with the leadership work you're doing and the fact that you're talking about these, what I like to refer to as essential skills rather than soft skills, have you seen a lot of kind of companies having these moments where they're like, we need to really start to identify leaders in a different way?
I think there's a difference between saying it and doing it a lot of the time. And I think people will voice it and people will actively look to, and that might result in a one day offsite or a short course, but that doesn't really stimulate change. We've got to use James's phrase, you've got to be intentional around what you're doing, and you've got to give yourself time to implement that change. Otherwise it isn't going to work. And for me, I had a parent ring me yesterday, and they were concerned on their own experiences of their son had come out of professional football and gone into an apprenticeship, and it's completely work from home. And both parents were saying, how are they ever going to learn workplace skills, and what does that even look like for a career when you're starting out in a completely digital sense? And it blew me away a little bit, really, because one, didn't know where to start with it, and two, it's an interesting question. How do apprentices and the bottom rung or the emerging rung of organizations, where do they go? Where do they start? And what does support look like for them in organizations?
It's a really great question, isn't it?
And the thing I'd add to that as well, Niall, is just we see at the moment, to your point about getting those younger people embedded into an organization, onboarding new staff and younger staff in particular is becoming very, very challenging for organizations. And I think that's partly because it's as Luke touched on, how intentional we need to be, in particular with that generation and that workforce as they enter into their first role, potentially sitting at a desk at home or coming into an office. So I just think there's something there. We probably won't get time to chat about it today, but I think that whole area of onboarding is a fascinating piece as well.
Yeah, and that's definitely one we're going to come back to in the next couple of weeks. Luke, I feel like giving the last word to you. I'm very conscious of the time, and we try to keep these short, but increasingly each week they become really interesting conversations, and it's hard to stop. From your perspective, what would you say is the biggest change you've seen over the last 2 years that's likely to impact on the future world?
Wow, tough question. I think for me, and it was going back, I think so. Prior to COVID, I did a lot of work in a property company, and I think the consensus in their global market was we were moving to this way anyway in terms of the world of work, but it's just expedited the process. And I think for me, when you look at diversity and inclusion and how committed most organizations are now to diversity and inclusion and having full D&I teams and full statements, mission statements, values based around diversity and inclusion, I think what the new way of working does, and what the impact of that is on diversity. Does it stall it? Does it hinder it? Does it help us? And how can we be mindful of that? For me, that's a massive area where I think hopefully there won't be as much of a change, but I would be probably slightly concerned about that.
Yeah, it's a really good point, really. And you've created a whole conversation that we're going to have to pick up, and I think we'll have to get you back on to
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. It's left us with something to think about, and maybe that will fill our time between now and next week. Luke, really appreciate you taking the time, man. It was an absolute pleasure. James, as always, enjoyed the chat.
Luke, thanks a million. Thanks again, Niall. Really enjoyed the chat.
And we'll talk to you all soon. Take care.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.